Have you ever wondered at what precise moment the person you raised stops seeing you as a father and starts seeing you as an obstacle to be removed? It usually doesn't happen in a grand, explosive argument or a dramatic shouting match. It happens in the quiet moments, in the subtle shifts of tone, and the way someone looks at you when they think they have finally outgrown your influence. For me, that moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late November, the kind of crisp, golden-hued Thanksgiving afternoon that is supposed to be synonymous with gratitude and family unity. I was sitting at the head of a mahogany table that I had purchased 2 decades ago, looking at a spread of food that I had paid for, in a house that I had meticulously maintained for years, when my son, Tyler, leaned forward with a patronizing, rehearsed calmness and told me that my presence was making things uncomfortable for his guests. The room was filled with the smell of sage, slow-roasted turkey, and the expensive scent of my daughter-in-law Jessica's perfume. It was a picture-perfect scene, the kind of tableau you see in magazines, meant to convey warmth and abundance. But the air felt thin. I remember the sound of the silverware against the porcelain plates, a rhythmic, sharp clinking that seemed to underscore the tension hanging over the table. Tyler's hand was resting on Jessica's, a protective, performative gesture. Her parents, the Millers, sat opposite me, their expressions carefully neutral, a thin veneer of civility masking the smug satisfaction of people who had finally secured a foothold in a world they hadn't earned. I didn't feel anger in that moment. There is no room for anger in high-stakes negotiation. Instead, I felt a sudden, icy clarity. It was the same sensation I used to get in the courtroom, that moment when a witness would finally slip up and reveal the flaw in their story. I looked at Tyler, my own flesh and blood, and saw a stranger wearing the face of a man who thought he had won. He told me that they wanted a private, intimate atmosphere for the holiday, and that I, being the landlord, was effectively just an outsider. He suggested that I retreat to the guest house, the small, detached unit over the garage, where I could eat my meal in solitude while they enjoyed the house that I had worked 40 years to pay for. He didn't even have the decency to raise his voice. He said it with the casual arrogance of a man who assumed his inheritance was already secured, and that the man who provided it was merely a nuisance to be managed. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of wind rattling the autumn leaves against the window pane. I didn't protest. I didn't ask why or beg for a seat at my own table. I didn't defend my right to be there. I simply set my napkin down on the table, smoothed it out, and looked at them one by one. I held Tyler's gaze for a second longer than was comfortable for him. I saw his smugness flicker, just for a heartbeat, as he tried to decipher my reaction. I stood up slowly, adjusted my jacket, and offered a faint, nearly imperceptible smile. I told them that I understood perfectly, that I would leave them to their dinner, and that I would ensure they had plenty of time to find a new place to stay. They laughed then. It was a nervous, confused sound, a release of tension that they misinterpreted as victory. They thought I was retreating. They thought I was the broken, lonely old man who would shuffle off to the guest house and nurse his wounds in silence. They didn't understand who they were dealing with because, for the last few years, I had allowed them to see me only as a father, not as the man I had been before Tyler was born. For 30 years, I was a senior partner at a Chicago-based law firm that specialized in real estate litigation and commercial disputes. My life was defined by contracts, deeds, zoning ordinances, and the cold, hard reality of property law. I spent decades disassembling the lives of people who thought they were cleverer than the law. I had spent my career dissecting the fine print, finding the leverage points that could bring a multi-million-dollar corporation to its knees, or evict a tenant who thought they had a loophole. I was a man who lived by the document. I viewed the world in terms of assets, liabilities, and, most importantly, clear, binding agreements. When I retired, I didn't retire from that mindset. I just stopped applying it to strangers. I had treated Tyler with a gentleness that I never showed a client. I gave him the house. I paid the taxes. I covered the insurance. And I handled the maintenance, all under the assumption that a father's role is to provide the foundation upon which his son can build a life. I had been a soft father. I had been the silent provider, the background character, who ensured the stage was set for his success. I had forgotten that people don't respect what they haven't had to struggle for. By giving them everything, I had robbed them of the capacity to value it. As I walked out of that dining room, my mind was already working. I wasn't thinking about the turkey or the holiday or the sting of the insult. I was thinking about the paperwork. I was thinking about the specific clauses in the informal occupancy agreement I had drafted, the one I had insisted we sign when they moved in, just to keep things professional, as I had jokingly told Tyler back then. I was thinking about the local state statutes regarding at-will tenancy and the exact steps required to execute a legal eviction. The professional in me, the one who had spent 3 decades winning cases in cold, windowless rooms, had woken up. And as I stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the backyard, heading toward the study in the guest house, I knew that the dinner party they were currently enjoying would be the last one they would ever host in this home. The leverage had shifted, and they didn't even realize the game had already ended. It is strange how quickly a house stops feeling like a home and starts feeling like a battlefield when you are not paying attention to the ground beneath your feet. The betrayal didn't start at the Thanksgiving table. That was just the grand opening of the final act. The betrayal started months earlier, in the small, seemingly insignificant decisions that Tyler and Jessica made. Each one calculated to test how far they could push the boundaries of my hospitality. It was the boiling frog method, though they were too arrogant to realize that I was the one holding the thermometer, carefully noting every rise in temperature. When I first offered them the house, it was an act of genuine, if perhaps naive, parental support. Tyler had claimed his startup was in a critical phase, and moving them into my secondary property, a home I had purchased years ago as a long-term investment, seemed like a sensible way to give them a head start. I thought I was buying them time. I didn't realize I was renting them my own irrelevance. The first sign was the remodeling. They started small, asking if they could modernize the living room. I agreed, thinking it was a healthy way for them to feel a sense of ownership. But then the modernization turned into an occupation. They painted over the original crown molding I had spent weeks restoring. They replaced the antique dining set, a piece that had been in my family for generations, with cheap, trendy furniture that looked like it had been bought from a catalog for social media influencers. Every time I visited, the house looked less like my property and more like a stage set for their digital lives. I would walk into the kitchen and see them laughing, filming content for their followers, and the moment I walked into the frame, the energy would shift. It wasn't that they were overtly rude at first. It was the way they would stop talking, the way Jessica would cast a glance at Tyler that clearly signaled, "The landlord is here, shut it down." They began to treat the home as an asset they owned, rather than a loan they were privileged to hold. They started hosting parties every weekend, filling my quiet, respectable neighborhood with loud music, and strangers who had no respect for the landscaping. I would find red Solo cups on the manicured lawn and cigarette butts crushed into the driveway. When I brought it up to Tyler, he didn't apologize. Instead, he would give me that familiar, condescending look, as if I were a meddling neighbor rather than his father. He would say things like, "Dad, we're trying to build a brand here, and this house is part of the image. You can't expect us to live like we're in the 50s. It was never about the house. It was about the power dynamic. They were rewriting the rules of the house, and with every rule they broke, they were signaling their disrespect for the man who paid the property taxes. The arrival of Jessica's parents, the Millers, was the final gear shifting into place. They moved in like they were royalty. They took over the guest suite as if it were a hotel room, and soon I became a ghost in my own property. I started seeing them in the hallways, whispering, and whenever I entered the room, they would change the subject. I wasn't stupid. I was a man who had spent 30 years negotiating settlements and uncovering hidden assets in divorces. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating a narrative where I was the intrusive, out-of-touch old man, and they were the young, victimized couple trying to carve out a life in a world that was stacked against them. They wanted to frame me as a nuisance, so that when they finally decided to claim the house, they could justify their actions to themselves and to anyone else. But here is where they made their fatal mistake. They assumed I was oblivious. They thought that because I was quiet and accommodating, I was weak. They didn't see the notebook I kept in my desk at the guest house. They didn't see the digital folder on my laptop, meticulously labeled with dates, times, and descriptions of every broken rule, every disrespect, and every conversation that revealed their true intentions. I began to track the expenses. I logged the cost of the utilities they wasted, the repairs I had to fund for the damage they caused, and the text messages where they explicitly discussed getting the old man out so they could list the house on Airbnb for the upcoming holiday season. They were running a business, using my capital, behind my back. I watched it all with a calm, analytical detachment. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. I felt no impulse to intervene, no need to save them from their own greed. Intervention would have tipped my hand too early. I needed them to continue the performance until they were so confident in their victory that they became sloppy. And they were sloppy. They were so busy planning their future, counting the imaginary money they would make once I was out of the picture, that they forgot to check the fine print of the residency agreement they had signed. They forgot that I was not just a father. I was a lawyer who had spent a career evicting people much smarter and much more dangerous than them. They were playing a game of checkers, and they were so focused on the next move that they didn't realize I had already cleared the board. I was simply waiting for the right moment, the perfect, high-stakes moment, to close the book on their little experiment. And the Thanksgiving dinner they were so desperate to host in my house was the perfect stage for the ending they had earned. While they toasted to their own cleverness inside the main house, I was sitting in the sanctuary of my study, surrounded by the only things that had never lied to me: paper. There is a profound, quiet beauty in the law. Unlike human relationships, which are messy, emotional, and unpredictable, the law is rigid. It is a structure of binary choices, valid or invalid, binding or unenforceable, breach or compliance. In the courtroom, I had spent 30 years wielding that structure like a scalpel, dissecting the lives of people who thought they were smarter than the rules they had agreed to follow. As I sat at my desk, listening to the muffled bass of their music drifting across the yard, I wasn't filled with rage. I was filled with the familiar, humming energy of preparation. I was a professional, and I was back on the clock. My investigation didn't require private detectives or hidden cameras. The evidence was already in my possession. It was a digital archive, a meticulous log I had kept since the day I handed them the keys. When I had drafted the original occupancy agreement, an informal at-will arrangement, I had included clauses that most people dismiss as standard legal boilerplate. They never read it, of course. To them, it was just a piece of paper to be signed, so they could move in and start their lives. They viewed it as a gesture of trust. I viewed it as an insurance policy. I pulled up the document on my screen, the cursor blinking rhythmically, waiting for my input. I reviewed the specific statutes regarding tenancy at will in this state. It was beautiful, really, because they had no formal lease, no exchange of rent for equity, and no long-term tenancy rights. Their status was entirely at my discretion. I spent the next 2 hours conducting a financial audit of the last 18 months. I pulled the bank statements, the utility bills, and the maintenance receipts. I highlighted every expense I had incurred to keep that house running, while they treated it like a playground. It wasn't just about the money. It was about establishing a record. I calculated the fair market value of the rental, the cost of the property taxes I had paid, and the damages incurred during their modernization of the property. I created a spreadsheet that laid it all out with clinical precision. If they wanted to play house, I would show them exactly what the cost of admission was. Every time Jessica's parents had stayed in the guest room, every time Tyler had hosted a party that violated neighborhood ordinances, it was all there, documented with dates, times, and corresponding photographs. I didn't feel like a father during this process. I felt like a senior partner reviewing a failing asset. I scrutinized the wording of our agreement, looking for the specific provision that allowed for immediate termination in the event of disrespect of property standards or conduct detrimental to the quiet enjoyment of the premises. It was all there, written in plain English, waiting to be invoked. I began to draft the formal notice to quit. There is a specific cadence to legal writing that I have always found soothing. It is direct, cold, and utterly devoid of sentiment. I wrote the letter, referencing the specific clauses they had breached. I laid out the timeline for their departure, leaving no room for negotiation or misunderstanding. I printed the document on high-quality bond paper. The printer's whir was the only sound in the room, steady and methodical. I took the document out, signed it with my fountain pen, and sat back, watching the ink settle into the paper. It was a perfect piece of work. It was final, it was legal, and it was devastating. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to throw a tantrum. All I needed to do was hand them this piece of paper, and the reality of their situation would crash down on them with the force of an oncoming train. I spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing my notes with local statutes. I made sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed. I anticipated their potential defenses. Would they try to claim they had a verbal agreement for long-term residency? I had the email threads where I had explicitly stated, in writing, that the arrangement was temporary and at my sole discretion. Would they try to involve their parents? I had the logs of their parents' unauthorized stays, which, under the terms of the agreement, were a violation of the guest policy. I was not just building a case, I was building a cage. By the time I finished, the house was silent. The party had died down, and the lights in the main house had dimmed. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The betrayal had hurt, in a way that only a parent can feel, but the process of legal retribution had cauterized the wound. I wasn't just a father who had been hurt. I was a man who had reclaimed his territory. I locked the drawer containing the notice, turned off the lamp, and looked out the window at the dark outline of the house. Tomorrow was going to be a very busy day, but for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, knowing exactly what needed to be done. The walk from the study back to the dining room felt like a journey between two different dimensions. In the study, I had operated in a world of logic, facts, and finality. As I stepped back into the hallway, the ambient noise of their laughter reached me, a sound that felt brittle and shallow now that I knew exactly how fragile their foundation truly was. I held the document in my hand, the crisp bond paper feeling heavier than it actually was. It was a simple, standard legal form, but in the context of the life they thought they had built, it was a wrecking ball. I didn't rush. There was no need to. The leverage had already shifted. The trap was already sprung. I only needed to present the bill. I walked into the dining room without knocking. The atmosphere inside was thick with self-satisfaction. They had clearly spent the last hour congratulating themselves on successfully sidelining me, the difficult parent. Jessica was pouring more wine, her laughter bright and piercing. Tyler was recounting some story, gesturing grandly with his glass, the picture of a man who owned everything he could see. When I entered, the conversation didn't stop immediately. They were too drunk on their own perceived victory to notice the change in the air. It was only when I walked all the way to the head of the table, pulling out the chair I had vacated only an hour ago, that the silence began to ripple through the room like a stone dropped in a still pond. The laughter died out in stages. Jessica looked up first, her smile faltering, replaced by a look of sharp, defensive annoyance. Tyler stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he processed my return. He looked at me, then at the document in my hand, and a flash of confusion crossed his face. He clearly expected me to be sulking in the guest house, perhaps nursing a drink or watching television, not returning to the scene with a document that looked official enough to stop a heart. I didn't say a word. I placed the document directly in the center of the table, right next to the gravy boat, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the placemat. The sound of the paper hitting the polished wood was distinct, a sharp, flat snap that silenced the clinking of silverware. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. My voice was a calm, low hum, the kind of tone I used when delivering a closing argument that I knew was already won. I told them that dinner was a fine idea, but that they had mistaken their status in this house. I explained that for the last 18 months, I had been under the impression that we were a family sharing a home, but that their actions tonight had clarified the nature of our arrangement. I pointed to the paper on the table. I told them that it was a formal notice to quit, a legal document that officially terminated their at-will occupancy of the property. I watched the color drain from Tyler's face, a slow gray process that started at his cheeks and reached his eyes. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice trembling, demanding to know what kind of sick joke this was. She grabbed the paper, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, and I watched the realization sink in. She didn't understand the law, but she understood the weight of the terminology. She saw the words eviction, unlawful detainer, and 30 days, and the arrogance that had defined her demeanor all night evaporated. It was replaced by a raw, terrified confusion. She looked at Tyler, expecting him to handle it, expecting him to pull some magic out of his sleeve. But Tyler was paralyzed. He was staring at the document as if it were a bomb. He knew me. He knew that I wouldn't waste ink on a threat I didn't intend to carry out. The silence in the room was absolute, so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on our chests. The turkey, the wine, the expensive decorations, it all suddenly looked cheap. I told them that the dinner was over, not because I was kicking them out of the room, but because they no longer had any claim to the space they were standing in. I stood there, arms folded, watching them scramble. It was a beautiful sight, the collapse of their entitlement. They had spent months acting like landlords, treating me like an employee, and in the span of 30 seconds, they had been reduced to what they actually were, guests who had overstayed their welcome. Tyler finally found his voice, sputtering, trying to use the word family like a shield. He tried to tell me that I couldn't do this, that I was crazy, that this was his home. I didn't engage with the emotional appeal. I didn't bother to debate the definition of family with a man who thought property rights were negotiable. I simply reminded him of the agreement he had signed, the one he hadn't bothered to read, and noted that the terms were explicit. I gave them 30 days, not to negotiate, not to argue, but to pack. And then I turned around, walked to the doorway, and paused. I told them that I expected the house to be clean and undamaged upon their departure, and that any failure to vacate would be met with the full force of the legal process. I left the room then, leaving them sitting in the sudden, suffocating quiet of their own downfall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what the look on their faces was, and it was the only apology I would ever receive. The next 30 days were not defined by shouting matches or dramatic standoffs. They were defined by the slow, grinding reality of administrative doom. Tyler tried to fight it, of course. He spent the first week calling every attorney he could find, searching for a loophole that would allow him to stay. He wanted to claim that I was acting out of malice, or that our family arrangement superseded the written contract. But the law, as I knew well, doesn't care about family dynamics when it is written in black and white on a valid, notarized document. Every lawyer he spoke to told him the same thing. I was within my rights. The documentation was airtight, and fighting it would only result in a legal bill they couldn't afford. It was a humiliating realization for him. He had spent years pretending he was a savvy entrepreneur, yet he couldn't even keep a roof over his head because he had neglected the basics of a contract. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a house when the people living there know they are on borrowed time. The energy shifted completely. The party stopped. The constant filming and content creation ceased. The aesthetic lifestyle they were trying to curate for their followers withered away, replaced by the chaotic reality of packing boxes and the realization that their social media projection was built on a foundation of sand. I went about my business as usual. I didn't gloat, and I didn't offer to help. I simply observed. I watched them pull their designer furniture apart, struggling to fit items into cardboard boxes, the same way they had struggled to fit into a life they hadn't earned. It was a lesson in humility, one that I had hoped they would learn through kindness, but which they were forced to learn through necessity. The day of the move was a rainy, gray Tuesday. It was fitting, I suppose. There was no closure, no heartfelt apology, and no final meal together. Just the dull thud of heavy boxes being loaded into a rental truck. Tyler wouldn't even look me in the eye. He moved with a kind of frantic, desperate energy, trying to preserve his dignity, but it was impossible. He knew, and I knew, that this was the end of the line. The Millers didn't even show up to help. They had quickly realized that their ticket to a free lifestyle had been canceled, and they were already looking for their next mark. It is amazing how quickly family disappears when the gravy train stops running. Watching them drive away, their truck struggling under the weight of possessions they couldn't truly afford, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound sense of relief. The house was mine again. The parasite had been removed, and the organism was finally beginning to heal. In the weeks that followed, the social fallout was predictable. They tried to spin the story to their friends, painting me as a cold, heartless tyrant who evicted his own son for no reason. But the truth has a way of surfacing when you strip away the embellishments. When people learned the details, that they hadn't paid a dime in rent, that they had treated my home like a playground, and that they had tried to exile me from my own property, the narrative shifted. The sympathy they were looking for didn't materialize. Instead, they were met with a cold indifference. They had traded their integrity for a lifestyle, and when that lifestyle collapsed, they were left with nothing but their reputations, which were now just as bankrupt as their bank accounts. I spent the first few nights back in the main house, just sitting in the living room. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't blast music. I just sat there, in the quiet, and felt the space. It was clean again. The air felt different. I walked through the rooms I had built and maintained, running my hand over the furniture they had tried to replace, and I realized that my life had been on hold. I had been living in the shadows of my own home, waiting for their approval, hoping for a connection, that they were incapable of giving because they were too focused on the transaction of life. I had been a father, but I had failed to be a man who commanded respect. I had been too busy providing, and in doing so, I had forgotten that respect is not a gift you give, it is a standard you set. People often mistake kindness for weakness. They assume that because you have the capacity to give, you have lost the spine to protect what you have built. My son learned a hard lesson that day, a lesson that would either define the rest of his life or repeat itself in another form. He learned that relationships are not defined by blood, but by the mutual respect that keeps them alive. If you occupy space in someone else's life, you are paying rent with your behavior. When that payment stops, the lease is terminated. It is a cynical view, perhaps, but it is the only one that ensures you are never used as a stepping stone by the people you are meant to protect. I poured myself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the setting sun filtering through the window. I looked out at the street, at the quiet, suburban peace that had finally returned to my life. I was alone, yes, but for the first time in years, I was not lonely. There is a vast difference between the two. Loneliness is the feeling of being misunderstood and undervalued by the people around you. Being alone is the state of being content with your own company, secure in your own boundaries, and at peace with the reality of the world. I took a sip of the drink, felt the warmth settle in my chest, and turned off the lights. The house was quiet. The house was mine. And tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, the day was entirely my own.